It is the summer of 1970, and Janis Joplin is sitting alone in a recording booth at Sunset Sound Studios in Los Angeles, listening to a playback of a track she has just laid down. The engineers are outside the glass, the other musicians have stepped out. For a few minutes, there is no audience, no performance, no one to convince of anything. She sits with a bottle of Southern Comfort, the drink she had made into a stage prop, a personality trait, a brand, and she listens to her own voice come back at her through the monitors. What she hears is extraordinary. Anyone hearing it would say so. And yet, the people who were present in those sessions would later describe something uncomfortable about those quiet moments between takes. Not sadness exactly. Something closer to the look of a person who has run a very long way toward something and arrived to find the place empty. She was 27 years old. She had been famous for 3 years. She had spent most of those years being told in various ways that she was too much, too loud, too hungry, too raw, and then being asked to be more of it. This is not a story about rock and roll excess. It is not about the 1960s, not really. It is about a specific woman who grew up being told she was wrong, who found one place where being wrong was applauded, and who poured herself into that place until there was nothing left to pour. What happened to Janis Joplin did not begin in 1970. It began much earlier in a flat, oil-stained town on the Gulf Coast of Texas, where the rules about who you were supposed to be left very little room for someone like her. Port Arthur, Texas sits at the edge of the Gulf Coast like something the land couldn't quite finish. In the 1940s and 1950s, it was an oil refinery town, functional, industrial, and organized around a very specific idea of how life should look. The men worked, the women kept house, the children went to church. On Sundays, the families drove past each other's homes and noted, without saying so directly, who was keeping up and who was slipping. Social order in Port Arthur was not enforced by law. It was enforced by attention, by the steady collective gaze of people who had very little else to regulate. Dorothy Joplin wanted her daughter to fit. This was not cruelty. It was the particular anxiety of a woman who understood, from experience, or what happened to girls who didn't. Dorothy was careful, contained, and alert to the opinions of others in the way that women of her generation and class often were, not because they were weak, but because the consequences of social failure fell on them most heavily. When Janis began to show signs of being difficult to contain, Dorothy's response was to try harder to contain her. She enrolled her in the right activities, she corrected her posture, she monitored what Janis wore. Seth Joplin, her father, was a different kind of influence. He worked at Texaco and read philosophy at home. He talked to Janis about ideas, about books, about the world beyond Port Arthur, in a way that most fathers in that town did not talk to their daughters. Those conversations mattered to her. She carried them. But they also produced a particular kind of confusion in a young girl. Her father suggested the world was large and worth thinking about, while everything around her insisted it was small and worth obeying. She grew up caught between those two instructions, and she never fully resolved them. By the time Janis was in her early teens, she was already visibly out of step. She was heavier than the girls around her, and in a culture that treated a girl's body as a measure of her discipline, this registered as a kind of personal failure. She had acne. She dressed oddly. She had opinions she expressed too directly, and a laugh that was too loud for polite rooms. None of these things were unusual in isolation, but together they marked her as someone who wasn't trying hard enough to disappear. And in Port Arthur, the pressure to disappear, for girls especially, was enormous. She began painting in her early teens, and then she found the blues. This is where her story usually softens into something romantic, the misfit girl who discovered her gift. But the reality of that discovery was more complicated. Music did not save Janis Joplin from Port Arthur. It gave her a reason to stop trying to belong to it. Those are different things, and the difference matters. She listened to Bessie Smith and Lead Belly and later to Odetta, artists who were not on the radio in Port Arthur in any ordinary rotation, artists she found by looking for something her immediate world couldn't give her. The blues spoke to a kind of suffering that was not genteel, not contained, not presentable. And she found that honesty more useful than anything being offered to her at school or church. But she was a white girl in a Texas town in the 1950s, and the music she was gravitating toward came from a tradition built by Black Americans out of conditions she had not experienced and could not fully understand. She absorbed it anyway, the way desperate people absorb what they need, without pausing to account for the distance between themselves and the source. At Thomas Jefferson High School, the social architecture was rigid and well-maintained. The popular girls were pretty in a specific, approved way: blonde or close enough slender, agreeable. Janis was none of these things and made insufficient effort to pretend otherwise. She was not simply unpopular, she was actively targeted. Students called her names in the hallways. She was excluded from the social rituals that organized teenage life, the parties, the pairings, and the careful negotiations of who was in and who was out. She ate lunch alone. She walked home alone. What is important here is not the cruelty itself, which was common, but what she did with it. Some people who are socially rejected in adolescence learn to need less. They find a way to reduce their hunger for acceptance until it becomes manageable, even useful. Janis did not do this. She went the other direction. Each rejection seemed to increase rather than diminish her need to be received, to be seen, to be told she was enough. This is not a flaw that can be explained simply. It may have been temperament, it may have been the particular combination of her father's intellectual openness and her mother's social anxiety, like producing a child who had been told simultaneously that she was worth something and that she wasn't presenting it correctly. Whatever the cause, the hunger was there, and it was large, and it did not shrink under pressure. She left Port Arthur for the first time at 17, driving to Los Angeles with a friend who had family there. She came back, she enrolled at Lamar University in Beaumont, then transferred to the University of Texas at Austin, where the atmosphere was looser, more willing to tolerate difference. In Austin, she found other misfits: folk singers, beatniks, people who had also grown up wrong for wherever they came from and had arrived at UT with the specific relief of people who had finally found a room that fit. She drank with them in bars near campus. She sang. She was funny and sharp and capable of holding a room without a microphone. But Austin was also where the cruelty sharpened into something more deliberate. In 1963, members of a University of Texas fraternity nominated Janis Joplin for Ugliest Man on Campus. It was a joke category, the kind of thing that announces itself as harmless because it's dressed as humor. She found out about the nomination. The story, depending on who told it, ends differently. Some say she laughed it off. Others say she was devastated. What is not disputed is that she left Texas shortly afterward and did not come back in any permanent way for years. The nomination was not an isolated act of cruelty. It was the concentrated expression of everything Port Arthur had been saying to her for a decade, now given an institutional form, complete with a ballot. She was not just disliked, she was publicly categorized as something that did not belong in the spaces designated for women. A joke, not a person, something to be voted on. She was 20 years old. She took that information and she left. She went to San Francisco, where people were beginning to suggest, loudly, that the old categories didn't apply anymore. She believed them, or she needed to. San Francisco in the early 1960s was not yet the place it would become. The Haight-Ashbury neighborhood was cheap and slightly run down, populated by students, artists, and people who had arrived from elsewhere with small amounts of money and large amounts of dissatisfaction. The counterculture that would later be photographed and documented and sold back to the world as a cultural moment was still forming, still genuinely provisional. In 1963, when Janis Joplin arrived for the first time, it was simply a place where the usual rules were applied less rigidly, where a woman could be loud and strange and not immediately punished for it. She was thin when she arrived, thinner than she had been in Texas, the result of amphetamine use that had begun in Austin and accelerated on the road. She was playing folk music in coffee houses, passing a hat, sleeping on floors. She had a circle of friends who were similarly unmoored, and for a time that unmooring felt like freedom rather than instability. She sang in small venues and people stopped talking when she did. This was new. In Port Arthur, she had been told to lower her voice. Here, her voice was the reason people turned around. But San Francisco in those years was also running on substances, and Janis ran on them with it. Amphetamines first. They suppressed appetite, kept her moving, gave her the compressed, jittery energy that felt, for a time, like productivity. Then, gradually, heroin. The first use of heroin is rarely dramatic. It tends to arrive quietly, pass between people in rooms where it has already become normal, offered without particular ceremony. What heroin did for Janis, what it does for many people who come to depend on it, was not produce euphoria so much as produce silence. The hunger that had been with her since childhood, the restless, unappeasable need to be accepted, went quiet. For the duration of the drug's effect, she did not need anything from anyone. This was not a small thing for a person who had spent 20 years needing constantly and being refused constantly. She was not secretive about her using, that which was itself a kind of statement. In the social world she was moving through, heroin carried a certain artistic credibility, was associated with jazz musicians, with a certain romantic darkness, with people who felt too much for ordinary life. This framing was dangerous because it made the drug into a personality trait rather than a dependency, and it gave the people around her a way to interpret her use as identity rather than illness. She was Janis. She lived hard. That was simply who she was. By 1965, people who knew her in San Francisco were becoming concerned. She was visibly deteriorating, losing weight at a rate that was alarming, her skin poor, her energy erratic. A friend named Chet Helms, who had known her in Texas and helped bring her to California, looked at her that year and made a decision that he believed, and at the time, was an act of care. He told her she needed to go home. He told her that if she stayed in San Francisco, she would die. She went back to Port Arthur. This return is one of the most painful passages in her story, not because of what happened there, but because of what she attempted. She was 22 years old, and she was trying with evident sincerity to become someone Port Arthur could accept. She enrolled again at Lamar University. She stopped using, or tried to. She dressed more conservatively. There's a photograph from this period that people who study her life tend to find striking. She is sitting with her family, her hair neat, wearing a modest blouse, looking at the camera with an expression that is difficult to read. She looks like someone performing normalcy with great concentration. She also, during this period, Sue got engaged. The man's name has been recorded in various accounts simply as a Texan with conventional expectations, someone who wanted a wife in the traditional sense of the word, someone who would build a quiet life inside the boundaries that Port Arthur recognized as a life. Janis appears to have wanted this too, or to have wanted to want it. She spoke about settling down. She talked about having children. Whether she believed any of it, or whether she was trying to convince herself, is impossible to say from the outside. What is clear is that the engagement ended. He left her, or she left the idea of him. Accounts differ, but the result was the same. Port Arthur again had looked at her and found her insufficient. There is something important in this sequence that is easy to pass over. She had gone back to Texas specifically to get clean, to slow down, to try on the life that the people around her had always insisted was the correct one. She had made the attempt in good faith, or something close to it, and it had not worked, not because she was incapable of effort, but because the effort required her to be someone she was not, and the person she was kept interrupting. When she returned to San Francisco in 1966, she was not returning in defeat, exactly. She was returning having confirmed something she had perhaps suspected, but not yet fully accepted, that there was no version of the conventional life that had room for her, and that waiting for one was a waste of time she didn't have. This conclusion was, in some ways, liberating. It was also, in other ways, a door closing. Chet Helms, who had sent her home the year before, was now managing a band called Big Brother and the Holding Company. They were loud, sprawling, not particularly polished, a psychedelic rock band in the mode that San Francisco was beginning to produce in quantity. They needed a singer. Helms thought of Janis. He called her, and she drove back up from Texas and walked into a rehearsal in June of 1966. The musicians in Big Brother remembered the first rehearsal clearly, years later, in separate interviews. They remembered that she sang and that the room changed. Sam Andrew, the guitarist, said later that he had never heard anything come out of a human body that sounded like that. Dave Getz, the drummer, said he felt the hair on his arm stand up. This was not hyperbole deployed after the fact. It is consistent across the accounts of people who were there, people who had no reason to exaggerate in the same direction. What the band offered her, beyond a vehicle for her voice, was a kind of belonging she had not previously experienced. They were men mostly, and they accepted her as an equal in the rough, unsentimental way that working musicians sometimes do. Not because they were ideologically committed to her equality, but because she was the best thing in the room, and they knew it. She went on the road with them, she slept in the same cheap motels, she shared the same bad food and broken equipment and long drives. She was, for perhaps the first time, part of something, but the need did not go away. It never went away. What changed was that she had found a context in which it could be expressed rather than suppressed. On stage, she could want everything from the audience, and the audience would give it to her, or give something that resembled it closely enough that the difference wasn't immediately apparent. She performed with a desperation that audiences interpreted as passion, and they were not entirely wrong. It was passion, but it was also desperation, and the two things were so thoroughly mixed in her that she may not have been able to separate them herself. Off stage, she remained the same person who had eaten lunch alone in Port Arthur. She fell for people quickly and completely, and she expected from them what she expected from audiences: total reception, total acceptance, constant confirmation. When the people she loved failed to provide this, it is not out of malice, but simply because no person can sustain that level of attentiveness indefinitely, she experienced it as abandonment. She would drink more, she would perform more, she would find someone new to need. She was using heroin again by 1967. The people around her knew, the band knew. They did not intervene in any sustained way, partly because intervention in that world was not culturally available. The counterculture had built much of its identity around the refusal of straight society's rules, and insisting that someone stop using drugs felt, to many people in that circle, like a betrayal of the values they had organized their lives around. The freedom to destroy yourself was, awkwardly, part of the freedom they were celebrating. So the people who cared about Janis Joplin watched her use and said things occasionally, through and then let it continue. And she, for her part, was not yet ready to hear anything different. The drug was still working. The hunger was still being quieted. The audiences were getting larger. By the spring of 1967, Big Brother and the holding company had been booked for a festival in Monterey, California. It was called the Monterey International Pop Festival, and it was going to be, by any measure, the largest gathering of its kind yet attempted. Janis Joplin was 24 years old, and almost no one outside of San Francisco had heard of her. That was about to change in the way that things change when they change all at once, suddenly, completely, and without the possibility of going back. The Monterey International Pop Festival took place over 3 days in June of 1967 on the grounds of the Monterey County Fairgrounds, roughly 90 miles south of San Francisco. It was organized by a committee that included John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas and the producer Lou Adler, and it was conceived as something more than a concert. As a demonstration that the youth culture gathering in American cities and college towns was a genuine cultural force, not a passing adolescent phase. The performers would play for free. The proceeds would go to charity. The audience would be peaceful. This was the argument the festival was making about itself, and for the most part, over those 3 days, it held. Big Brother and the holding company played twice. The first performance on Saturday afternoon was not filmed at Janis's request, or rather, at the request of the band's advisors who were negotiating terms with the documentary filmmaker, D.A. Saul Pennebaker, and had not yet reached an agreement. This decision, made in a trailer somewhere on the festival grounds by people trying to protect a business interest, would become one of the minor ironies of her career. The performance that first showed the world what she could do was not preserved. Only the second one was. The Sunday performance is the one that exists on film, and it is, by any honest assessment, extraordinary. She sang Ball and Chain, a blues song written by Big Mama Thornton, and she did something with it that had not been done in that setting before. She did not perform it so much as inhabit it, moving across the stage with a physical abandon that the audience had not seen from a white woman in that context, or perhaps in any context. She screamed, she pleaded, she doubled over. She looked at various moments, like someone in genuine pain, and the audience, 20,000 people in the afternoon California sun, went completely silent in the middle of it, which is one of the rarest things that can happen at a large outdoor concert. Mama Cass Elliot was filmed in the audience during the performance, watching with an expression of open astonishment, mouthing what appeared to be the words "wow" or something similar. This footage has been replayed countless times in the decades since, used as a kind of shorthand for the impact of the moment. It captures something real, but it also, in the way that iconic images do, tends to flatten what was actually happening. What was actually happening was a transaction. Janis Joplin walked onto that stage as a woman who had spent her entire life being told she was too much. She walked off it having been told, by 20,000 people simultaneously, that she was exactly enough. The crowd's response was not polite appreciation. It was something closer to need, the audience's own hunger meeting hers, and each feeding the other. She had found the mechanism that worked. She had found the place where all the things that had made her wrong in Port Arthur made her right. The problem with mechanisms is that they require increasing force to produce the same result. This is true of drugs. It is also true of the relationship between a performer and an audience, when the performer is using the audience to answer a psychological question that the audience cannot actually answer. After Monterey, the crowds got larger. The performances got more intense. She gave more of herself each time. Calm because the amount she had given the time before no longer produced the same quiet. The hunger came back faster. It required more to satisfy it, and then more again. After the festival, the machinery of the music industry arrived. Record labels sent representatives. Managers made calls. Albert Grossman, who had managed Bob Dylan and Peter, Paul, and Mary, and who understood better than almost anyone how to take a raw talent and build it into a commercial property, reached out to Janis directly. This was significant because Grossman did not approach artists he wasn't certain about. His interest was a form of validation that she received as something more personal than it was. Grossman was a large, white-haired, deliberately slow-moving man who had built his career on the ability to identify what an artist's public face should be and then construct it with precision. He was not warm exactly, but he was attentive in a way that people who needed attention found compelling. He listened carefully. He asked the right questions. He made her feel, in their early conversations, like someone was finally taking the full measure of her seriously. She signed with him. The contract she signed gave Grossman's management company a percentage of her earnings that was, by any later accounting, extremely generous to Grossman. This was not unusual for the period. Artist contracts in the late 1960s were routinely structured to benefit managers and labels far more than the artists themselves, and most artists, especially young ones new to commercial success, signed what was put in front of them without the legal representation that might have produced different terms. Janis signed. She was 24. She had been poor for most of her adult life, and someone powerful had just told her she was worth investing in. What Grossman offered her, beyond the contract, was a vision of who Janis Joplin could be as a product. The Southern Comfort bottle, the feather bows, the multiple necklaces layered over each other, the laughing, drinking, outrageous public persona that said, "I don't care what you think of me." This persona was, in a specific and important sense, a refinement of something real. She did drink Southern Comfort. She was outrageous. But the image Grossman helped construct took those authentic traits and amplified them into a brand. And once a person becomes a brand, the brand begins to make demands on the person. She was expected to be Janis Joplin in public at all times. At press interviews, she performed. At parties, she performed. On the tour bus, she performed. The performance was different in each setting, rawer backstage, more controlled for journalists. But it was always a performance, always calibrated to confirm what people expected of her. The woman who sat alone in the recording booth, listening to her own voice come back at her through the monitors, was not the woman the public was buying. Big Brother and the holding company released their major label debut, Cheap Thrills, in August of 1968. The album cover was drawn by Robert Crumb, the underground comic artist, in a style that was deliberately crude and carnivalesque. Band members drawn as cartoon figures, I song titles scrawled in comic book lettering. It was countercultural in its aesthetic, but entirely mainstream in its ambition. It was released on Columbia Records, one of the largest labels in the country, and it was designed to sell. It sold extraordinarily well. It reached #1 on the Billboard charts and stayed there for 8 weeks. The success of Cheap Thrills produced the first visible rupture in the arrangement that had been sustaining her. Grossman and others around her began suggesting that Big Brother was holding her back, that the band's musicianship was not equal to her voice, that she needed a more professional outfit behind her if she was going to have the career her talent warranted. There was truth in this assessment in a narrow technical sense. The musicians in Big Brother were not polished players. But the assessment missed something that was not technical. The band was the place where she had first felt she belonged. They had accepted her before she was famous, which meant their acceptance was not contingent on her fame. Leaving them would mean returning to a condition she had spent years trying to escape, being alone in a room, waiting to find out if the people around her would stay. She left them anyway. In November of 1968, she announced she was going out on her own, forming a new band. The members of Big Brother found out through the press, or close to it. The departure was handled with the efficiency of a business decision, rather than the care of a personal one. Sam Andrew, who had been her closest friend in the band, said years later that he understood the professional logic and that he never fully got over it. She assembled the Cosmic Blues Band, a larger horn-driven ensemble that was more musically sophisticated and considerably less cohesive. She went back on the road. The shows were inconsistent, sometimes transcendent, sometimes effortful in a way that her Big Brother performances never were. The new band didn't know her the way the old one did. The interplay was different. She was the undisputed center now, the name above the title, the product being sold, and the band existed to serve that product rather than to share the stage with her as equals. The first album with the new band, I Got Demo Cosmic Blues Again Mama, released in 1969, received mixed reviews. Some critics found it overproduced, some found her voice strained. The word that appeared in several reviews used without apparent awareness of what it was actually describing, and was trying. She sounded like she was trying, which was accurate and which would have been unnecessary to note if she hadn't previously sounded like she wasn't trying at all, like the music was simply moving through her without effort, the way it had at Monterey. She continued touring, she continued drinking. The heroin use, which had slowed during the period surrounding Cheap Thrills, returned. She gave interviews in which she was funny and self-deprecating, and performed the role of the girl from Texas who couldn't believe any of this had happened to her. She told journalists she just wanted to be loved. She said this so often and so openly that it began to function as a deflection, a truth stated so plainly that it stopped people from looking for the deeper truth underneath it. The deeper truth was that the thing she had found at Monterey, the mechanism that quieted the hunger, was becoming less reliable. The audiences were still there. The applause was still there. But in the hours after a show, in the motels and hotel rooms and tour buses, the quiet that the performance produced was lasting for shorter and shorter periods before the hunger came back. She needed the next show before she had recovered from the last one. She needed the next drink before the current one had worn off. She was chasing a feeling that kept receding, and she was running faster to catch it, and the running itself was beginning to show. By the time 1969 arrived, Janis Joplin was no longer simply a musician. She had become a figure, something the culture was using to think about itself, to argue about, to project onto. Or this happens to certain artists at certain moments, and when it happens, it tends to be experienced by the artist not as elevation, but as a kind of displacement. The figure that the culture constructs is built from the artist's materials, their voice, their image, their public statements, but it is assembled by other people, according to other people's needs, and it does not necessarily resemble the person it was built from. The press had settled on a narrative for her that was simple enough to repeat and complicated enough to seem insightful. She was the ugly duckling who had become a swan. She was the girl from nowhere who had arrived somewhere. She was proof that authenticity could triumph over convention. This narrative was not entirely false, but it required editing. It required leaving out Port Arthur's continuing presence in her, like the unresolved hunger, the dependency, the pattern of relationships that kept ending the same way. The narrative required a protagonist who had overcome, and she had not overcome. She had redirected. The Cosmic Blues Band toured extensively through the early months of 1969, playing venues that were considerably larger than anything she had played with Big Brother. The scale of the operation had expanded dramatically. More crew, more equipment, more logistics, more money moving in more directions. She was now the center of a small industry, and the industry had its own momentum, its own requirements, its own reasons for continuing, regardless of whether the person at its center was holding together. In February of 1969, she appeared on The Dick Cavett Show. It is one of the most watched interviews of her career, replayed frequently in documentaries and online, and it is easy to see why. She is funny, quick, self-aware, disarming in the way that very intelligent people who have learned to perform their intelligence can be. She talks about Port Arthur. She makes jokes about her appearance. She drinks on camera. Cavett is charmed. The audience is charmed, and she seems for most of the interview to be genuinely enjoying herself. But there is a moment, brief and easy to miss, where Cavett asks her something about loneliness, whether fame is lonely or something to that effect, the precise wording varying depending on the transcript, and her expression changes before she can manage it. Not dramatically, just a small shift, a momentary dropping of the performance, the face of the woman in the recording booth rather than the woman on stage. She recovers it almost immediately, makes another joke, and the interview continues. No one in the studio audience appears to notice. She was drinking heavily throughout the tour, and the drinking had ceased to be primarily recreational and become primarily functional. She needed a certain amount of alcohol to perform, or believed she did, which by that point amounted to the same thing. The Southern Comfort bottle she carried on stage had started as a genuine preference, and then became a prop, and then became a requirement. Stagehands refilled it before shows. The bottle was part of the act, which meant the alcohol was part of the act, which meant the act could not happen without the alcohol. In April of 1969, she played a concert in Tampa, Florida, and was arrested backstage afterward on a charge of using vulgar and obscene language, a charge so transparently pretextual that it reads from a distance almost as comedy. A local police officer had apparently been offended by something she said from the stage, and the arrest was made with the kind of solemn procedural gravity that authority sometimes deploys when it wants to remind someone of their place. She paid a fine. The charges were later dropped, but the arrest was reported widely, and the coverage it received was not sympathetic. It confirmed, for the portion of American culture that found her threatening, that she was exactly the kind of problem they had suspected she was. The coverage also more quietly confirmed something else, that the rules applied to her differently than they applied to male performers who behaved in comparable or worse ways on stage. The male rock musicians of her era said and did things from stages that were never prosecuted, never even documented as concerns. She said something in Tampa that offended a policeman and was handcuffed backstage. The disparity was not commented on in the coverage at the time. It was simply the water everyone was swimming in. She went to Woodstock in August of 1969. This is one of the stranger episodes of her career, not because of what happened there, but because of what she felt about it afterward. Woodstock has been remembered, in the cultural shorthand that survives from that era, as a moment of collective transcendence. 500,000 people in a field, it peaceful and muddy and briefly utopian. Her performance there has been less celebrated than many others from the same event. She went on very late, in the early hours of Sunday morning, after days of rain and chaos and logistical collapse. She was, by multiple accounts, extremely intoxicated. The performance was ragged, not unwatchable, but ragged. The voice occasionally finding its way through and occasionally not. The connection with the audience that had been so electric at Monterey, less certain here. She knew it. In interviews afterward, she was dismissive of the festival, calling it a bad gig, and she was not wrong about that specific assessment. But her dismissiveness also contained something more private, a discomfort with the gap between the mythology of the event and what she had actually experienced. Noon, which was 3 days of disorganization, physical discomfort, and a performance she was not proud of. Woodstock was, in a specific sense, the inverse of Monterey. At Monterey, she had been unknown and had exceeded every expectation, including her own. At Woodstock, she was famous and the mythology preceded her, and she had not met it. The standard had been set by her own previous performance, and she had fallen short of it, and the gap was visible, at least to her. In the fall of 1969, she dissolved the Cosmic Blues Band. The reasons given were professional, musical incompatibility, a desire for a different sound, and these reasons were not false, but they were not complete. The band had never cohered emotionally the way Big Brother had. The musicians were more accomplished, but they were also, in a sense, employees. And you cannot get from employees what you get from people who are in the thing with you. She took several months off, which for her meant a reduction in touring rather than actual rest. She spent time in Brazil, a trip that has been described variously as a vacation, a creative retreat, and an escape. She was there for several weeks. She was photographed on beaches looking relaxed in a way she did not always look in American photographs. Less performed, more provisional. She had a relationship there, brief and apparently genuine, with a man named David Niehaus, an American she met by chance who had no connection to the music industry and no particular investment in her being Janis Joplin. She came back from Brazil and began assembling a new band, which she called the Full Tilt Boogie Band. They were younger than the Cosmic Blues musicians, less formally trained, more willing to follow where she led. The rehearsals went well. People who were present described an energy in the room that had been absent from the Cosmic Blues sessions, a looseness, a willingness to play. She also, around this time, made a decision about heroin that was not a decision to stop using it, but something more ambiguous, a decision to manage it, to keep it from becoming visible again, to maintain the appearance of functionality while continuing to use. This is a very specific kind of relationship with a drug, and it requires a great deal of energy to maintain, because the drug's nature is to become less manageable over time, not more. She was allocating cognitive resources to the project of appearing fine that could not be allocated to anything else. Nikonusörst twice by Sorin. Her friends and bandmates who were paying attention noticed that she seemed tired in a way that sleep wasn't fixing. The Full Tilt Boogie Band went on the Festival Express tour in the summer of 1970, a train journey across Canada stopping at major cities, with multiple acts performing at each stop. The tour has been documented in film footage that survived and was released decades later, and the footage is remarkable for what it shows of her in an unguarded setting. On the train between cities, without a stage and without an audience, she is loud and funny and generous and deeply, visibly lonely in a way that the on-stage performance was designed to conceal. There is footage of her singing in the train's bar car with other musicians, formal, spontaneous, the kind of music made for no one in particular, and she is extraordinary in it. Better in some ways than in the formal performances, because the hunger is still there, but the performance architecture around it is absent, and what remains is simply her voice and what it was doing and why. She is singing to the people in the car. She is making eye contact. She is making sure with a kind of quiet urgency that they are listening. She was 27 years old on that train. She had been famous for 3 years. The Full Tilt Boogie Band was the best group she had worked with since Big Brother, and she knew it. The new album was coming together. There were people around her on that train who genuinely cared about her. Not about the product, but about her. None of it was enough to answer the question she had been asking since Port Arthur. The question had not changed. When only the size of the audience she was asking it of had changed, and the audience, whatever its size, had never been equipped to answer it. Albert Grossman operated out of an office in New York and a large estate in Woodstock, New York, that he had purchased in the mid-1960s and expanded into something that functioned simultaneously as a home, a recording facility, and a statement about the kind of power he had accumulated. The estate was called Bearsville, and it would eventually become the name of a record label he founded and a recording complex he built on the surrounding land. It was the physical expression of a philosophy Grossman held about the music business. that the people who controlled the infrastructure around artists ultimately controlled more than the artists themselves. He was not a predator in the simple sense. He believed genuinely that the artists he managed were talented and worth developing, and his track record before Janis, Dylan, Peter, Paul, and Mary the band suggested he knew how to develop them. But his model of development was also a model of ownership, and the two things were not easy to separate. He built the career, and in building it, he acquired a stake in it that went beyond the contractual. He acquired a perspective on what the career should be that was not always the same as the artist's perspective, and when the two perspectives conflicted, the conflict was rarely resolved in the artist's favor. With Janis, the arrangement had specific contours that were shaped by who she was and what she needed. She needed to be told she was worth investing in. Grossman told her this, and he meant it. But the investment was structured so that his return on it was guaranteed regardless of her well-being. The percentage he took from her earnings, reported in various accounts as somewhere between 25 and 40%, depending on the revenue stream, was not unusual for the era, but it was extracted from an artist who had grown up without money and who had no framework for evaluating whether the terms were fair. She trusted him because he had power, and because he had chosen her, and for someone with her history, being chosen by someone powerful carried a weight that was not easily distinguished from love. The machinery that surrounded her by 1969 and 1970 was considerable. There were booking agents, road managers, publicists, label representatives, lawyers whose primary relationship was with the label rather than with her, Sue and a rotating cast of assistants and hangers-on whose function was not always clear. She was the revenue-generating center of the structure, and the structure's primary interest was in keeping the revenue generating. This meant keeping her performing, which meant keeping her functional enough to perform, which was not the same thing as keeping her well. The distinction between functional and well is one that the music industry of that era did not typically make, and in many cases actively worked against. A performer who was well might decide to take 6 months off. A performer who was functional enough to get on stage would get on stage. The incentive structure was entirely oriented toward the latter. Road managers carried what were sometimes called maintenance supplies, a phrase that in certain contexts meant exactly what it sounds like: substances that kept performers operational between shows. Whether this was true in Janis's specific case is not fully documented, but the broader practice was common enough that it was not remarkable to the people working in the industry at the time. She recorded, "I Got Dem Ol' Cosmic Blues." Again Mama in the spring of 1969, with the new band and a production approach that was more elaborate than anything she had done with Big Brother. The producer was Gabriel Meckler, who had also produced Steppenwolf, and his instinct was toward a fuller, more orchestrated sound. Horns arranged with care, backing vocals layered, the overall texture thicker and more polished than Cheap Thrills had been. But the result was an album that sounded expensive and often felt it in the way that expensively produced records sometimes feel like they are compensating for something. The reviews, when the album came out in September of 1969, were pointed in a specific way. Critics who had loved her with Big Brother found the new record overwrought. Rolling Stone, which had championed her, published a review that used the word mannered. The Village Voice was less charitable. The criticism stung her. She had given interviews before the release in which she talked about the new album with genuine excitement, describing it as a step forward, and the reception read the step as sideways at best. What the reviews did not engage with, because critics generally do not engage with business structures, was the degree to which the album's sound had been shaped by decisions that were not entirely hers. The horn arrangements, the production choices, the sequencing, these had all been subject to input from people whose primary concern was commercial viability, not artistic integrity. She had opinions about how the record should sound, and some of those opinions had been accommodated and others had not. The final product was a negotiation, as most major label records are, and the terms of the negotiation were not equal. There was also the matter of her voice. The voice on Cosmic Blues was different from the voice on Cheap Thrills, and the difference was audible to people who were listening carefully. It was not worse exactly. It was more controlled, more technically deliberate. But something had changed in the quality of its desperation. The rawness that had made cheap thrills feel live, felt like something happening in real time, was less present. She was singing more carefully, which is not the same as singing better, and the care showed. She was aware of this herself. In interviews from the period, she talked about finding her voice again, about wanting to strip back the production, about the tension between what she wanted to sound like and what the people around her thought she should sound like. These interviews were given to journalists who were primarily interested in the drama of the story, the girl who made it, struggling with success, and they tended to be published in ways that emphasize the emotional narrative over the structural one. You're the structural story, a young woman with limited business experience locked into a contract that gave other people substantial control over her work, was less interesting to write about because it was less unusual. It was happening to artists everywhere, all the time. Her relationship with Grossman was never simple, and it became less simple as her career progressed and she began to develop opinions about her own direction that did not always align with his. She was not, by any account, passive in her professional dealings. She had strong views about what she wanted to do and was willing to express them. But the expression of strong views by an artist in a management relationship is only as effective as the contract allows, and her contract did not allow much. There were arguments. People who were present in meetings between them have described Grossman as very still and very quiet when she pushed back on something, not hostile, but immovable in the way that people are immovable when they know the structure is on their side. She would talk, he would listen, and then, generally, the thing would proceed, as he had indicated it would proceed. She drank more at those meetings, or before them, or after them. People noticed. The label Columbia Records had its own relationship with her that was distinct from Grossman's, but complementary to it. Columbia had signed her through the Cheap Thrills deal and had invested in her success in the way that major labels invest, with money and with expectations, both of which create obligations. They wanted product on a regular cycle. They wanted singles that could be promoted. And they wanted the artist to be available for press, for television appearances, for the machinery of commercial music promotion that operated on a schedule that had nothing to do with the internal rhythms of an artist's creative life. She gave them what they wanted, mostly. She appeared on television. She did the interviews. She was good at the publicity work in a specific way. She was quotable. She was interesting. She said things that editors wanted to print. But the publicity work required her to be performing constantly, not just on stage, but in every room she entered. And the performance was exhausting in a way that the people scheduling her appearances did not factor into the schedule. By the time she began working on what would become Pearl in the late summer of 1970, her relationship with Grossman was fraying. There were disputes about money, specifically about royalties and accounting that she had begun to question, possibly with the assistance of legal advice she had not previously sought. The disputes were not resolved before her death. They were resolved afterward, in negotiations between Grossman and her estate, in terms that were not made fully public. The Full Tilt Boogie Band had been rehearsing and performing through the summer, and the dynamic was different from anything she had worked with since Big Brother. The musicians, Brad Campbell on bass, Clark Pearson on drums, Ken Pearson on organ, Richard Bell on piano, and John Till on guitar, were committed, attentive, and collectively oriented toward serving what she was doing rather than pursuing their own separate agendas. She trusted them in the way she had trusted the Big Brother musicians, which was not something she had managed with the Cosmic Blues Band. She talked openly in the summer of 1970 about getting clean. She had reduced her heroin use, though the accounts of how much and how successfully vary, depending on the source. She was drinking as heavily as ever, which her doctors had cautioned her about, and which she had not, apparently, found reason enough to change. She described alcohol in interviews as safer than heroin, which in one narrow sense was true, and in another sense was a form of reasoning that allowed her to believe she was making progress when she was substituting one problem for a different one. She was recording. She was writing. She was, by the accounts of people who saw her in the studio that summer, more focused and more present than she had been in years. The producer of Pearl, Paul Rothchild, who had previously worked with The Doors, said later that she was the most naturally gifted vocalist he had ever recorded, and that the sessions had a quality of concentration and intention that surprised him given what he had expected from her reputation. The machine around her continued to run. The bookings were made. The promotional plans were laid. The album was scheduled for release. Everything was in motion. The way things are in motion when a commercial structure has been built around a person and the structure's momentum has become independent of the person's own. She was 27 years old and the machine was running very smoothly, and she was the only moving part it could not replace. There's a letter Janis Joplin wrote to her parents in 1965 from San Francisco during her first extended stay in the city. The letter has been quoted in various biographies in fragments, and what survives of it is written in a voice that is different from the public voice, quieter, more tentative, with none of the performed bravado that characterized her interviews and stage presence. She describes the city, the people she has met, the music she is playing, and then, toward the end, she writes something to the effect that she is doing well and that she hopes they are not worried. And the combination of those two statements, the reassurance and the acknowledgement that there is something to be reassured about, suggests a person who is aware of the gap between what she is presenting and what is actually happening, and who is working to manage how that gap appears to the people she loves. She wrote to her parents regularly throughout her life. The letters were not always honest in the factual sense. She minimized the drug use, the instability, the specific texture of the life she was living, but they were honest in a different sense, in that they revealed a person who had never stopped wanting her family's approval and had never found a way to earn it on terms that didn't require her to be someone else. Dorothy Joplin received these letters and worried. Seth Joplin received them and, by most accounts, maintained the intellectual openness that had always characterized his relationship with his daughter, while also not fully understanding what the life she was describing actually looked like in practice. Sentiamo Pizzane. Her sister Laura was younger and closer in some ways. They shared a sensibility, a humor, a way of looking at the family that required a certain amount of irony to survive. Her brother Michael was less close. The family attended her concerts occasionally, and the accounts of those visits suggest a particular discomfort on both sides. The family watching their daughter and sister be Janis Joplin in public, the performer aware of their presence in the audience, each party slightly uncertain how to behave in a context that belonged fully to neither of them. She wanted her family to understand her. She also clearly did not show them enough of her actual life to make understanding possible. This was not simply self-protection. It was also probably a form of shame, not about who she was, but about the specific conditions of her life, the chaos and the dependency and the pattern of relationships that kept ending badly. She could not explain those things to her parents without also explaining the need that drove them, and the need itself was too old and too entangled with her childhood to be explained without implicating the people she was explaining it to. The relationships she formed with men were numerous and followed a pattern that was visible from early on and that she herself described in various interviews and in conversations reported by friends with a clarity that suggested she understood the pattern intellectually while being unable to interrupt it. She fell hard. She gave everything. She expected the same in return and was consistently, painfully disappointed when it was not forthcoming. Or she interpreted the disappointment as confirmation of something she had always suspected about herself, that she was too much, that the things Port Arthur had said about her were not entirely wrong, that the people who left were leaving for reasons that were fundamentally about her. Country Joe McDonald, the folk and rock musician, was one of the more significant relationships of her San Francisco years. They were together, off and on, in the mid to late 1960s, in the loose way that relationships existed in that world. Not formalized, not exclusive, not structured by any of the conventions that would have made the terms clear. He cared about her, by his own account, and she cared about him. Time in the relationship was also chronically unstable because the context it existed in was unstable, and because both people in it were using substances and performing publicly and living without the kind of daily regularity that relationships tend to require to cohere. She called him when she was in trouble. He came sometimes, and sometimes he didn't. Not out of indifference, but because the pull of her need was sometimes more than a person could answer consistently. She did not experience it as inconsistency. She experienced it as abandonment, each time fresh, as if the previous times had not established a pattern she could have predicted. David Niehaus, the man she had met in Brazil during her time off in early 1970, was different in a way that people who knew her found significant. He was not in the music industry. He was not trying to be. He had no particular investment in her being Janis Joplin. He had reportedly not known who she was when they first met, which in the context of her life by that point was an extraordinary condition for a relationship to begin under. She could, with him, be something closer to the person in the recording booth rather than the person on the stage. She wanted him to come to the United States and be with her. He was not ready to do that. He was traveling, uncommitted to a fixed life, and the particular shape of what she was offering, which involved entering the gravitational field of a famous person's career, was not something he was able to accept. She understood this intellectually. She felt it emotionally as another version of the same story, another person who would not stay. And the engagement she entered into in the summer of 1970 to a man named Seth Morgan came after a courtship of only a few weeks. Morgan was 21 years old, the son of a wealthy New York family, good-looking in a way that drew attention and possessed of the kind of self-confidence that people who have grown up with money often carry, regardless of whether it has been earned. He was also, by the accounts of virtually everyone who knew him, not equipped to be what Janis needed, which was someone stable and attentive and capable of being present in the specific way that her history required. She knew this, or knew something like it. Friends who spoke with her about the engagement in the weeks after it was announced described her as happy, but also, beneath the happiness, aware of the speed of it, aware that she had moved very quickly. Added that she had not taken the time to evaluate what she was getting into, that the decision had been made with the part of her that needed an answer rather than the part that knew how to find a good one. She went ahead anyway. The engagement was announced. Morgan gave interviews. The wedding was planned. He was not faithful to her during the engagement. This was known among people in their circle and was not, apparently, concealed with great effort. She knew or suspected and did not break the engagement. The reasons for this are not fully recoverable, but they are not difficult to imagine for someone who had spent her life treating the presence of another person as more valuable than the terms of their presence. He was there. He had chosen her. That he had also chosen other people simultaneously was a fact she was willing to absorb in order to maintain the arrangement. The women she was involved with occupied a different space in her life and have been written about with varying degrees of care and accuracy in the decades since her death. She was openly bisexual in a period when that openness was not without cost. It gave the press additional material for the narrative of her as transgressive, which was a narrative she had complicated feelings about, because it was partly accurate and partly a way of reducing her to a type. The women she was with tended to be people she was genuinely fond of rather than people she was performing her identity for. The relationships were quieter, less dramatic, less entangled with the machinery of her public life. Peggy Caserta, Cy, with whom she had a relationship that spanned several years in various intensities, has written about those years in a memoir that is frank to the point of discomfort. What emerges from that account, whatever allowances are made for its perspective, is a portrait of two people who were using each other in the specific way that people who are both dependent on substances use each other. As company in the dependency, as confirmation that the dependency is normal because someone else shares it, as a mirror in which the need looks like intimacy. Caserta has said in interviews over the years that she has spent a long time thinking about whether she helped Janis or harmed her, and that the answer, as far as she can determine, is that the two things were not separable. The people around Janis in those years, friends, lovers, bandmates, her acquaintances, Woodstock, have been asked in interviews and in the written accounts they produced whether they could have done something differently, whether there was a moment when a different choice by someone close to her might have changed the outcome. The answers are, almost uniformly, some version of the same thing: that she was very difficult to help, that she refused help in the specific way that people refuse it when they are not yet ready to accept it, that the need she carried was so large and so old that addressing it would have required more than any single person could have provided. This is probably true. It is also, in another sense, a way of distributing responsibility so widely that it dissolves. The people closest to her were not a single entity. They were individuals who made individual choices on individual days, knew about whether to say something or stay silent. whether to stay or leave, whether to make the heroin available or withhold it, whether to take her at her word when she said she was fine. The aggregate of those individual choices produced a specific outcome, and the outcome was not invisible to any of them. She performed at Harvard Stadium in August of 1970, one of the last large-scale shows before the Pearl sessions began in earnest. The concert was recorded and footage exists. She is extraordinary in it. The full-tilt boogie band behind her, the voice in full command, the connection with the audience restored to the quality it had at Monterey, perhaps exceeded. She moves across the stage with the physical freedom that characterized her best performances. She screams and pleads and laughs and wipes sweat from her face with the back of her hand. At one point, between songs, she says something to the audience about how good it feels to be there, to be playing, and her voice carries in it something that is not performance, a genuine relief, the relief of a person who has found, for the duration of a song, an answer to a question they cannot otherwise answer. The song ends. The relief ends with it. The sessions for Pearl began at Sunset Sound Studios in Los Angeles in September of 1970. Paul Rothchild, who had produced the Doors' most successful records and who had a reputation for coaxing performances out of difficult artists in difficult circumstances, ran the sessions with a combination of technical precision and deliberate informality. He kept the atmosphere loose, kept the hours flexible, and yet let the musicians find their way into the material without imposing a rigid structure on the process. He understood, or seemed to understand, that what Janis produced best was not produced under pressure, but alongside it, in the spaces between takes, in the moments when the recording light was off and she was simply singing to see what the song felt like. The band was ready in a way her previous studio configurations had not been. The Full Tilt Boogie Band had spent the summer touring, and the touring had done what touring does for a good band. It had worn away the formal edges and replaced them with something more instinctive. Richard Bell's piano was particularly important in the sessions. His playing had a quality that complemented her voice without competing with it, filling space in the way that a good accompanist fills space, not by adding more, but by providing exactly what the melodic line needed in order to feel supported rather than crowded. She was, in the early weeks of the sessions, more concentrated than she had been in any previous studio setting. Rothchild commented on this to people at the time and repeated it in interviews afterward. She came in prepared. She had thought about the songs. She had opinions about arrangements that were specific and defensible, and that, when she explained them, turned out to be correct. The kind of opinions that come from someone who is hearing the music clearly rather than reacting to it. There was a quality of deliberateness to her engagement with the material that was different from the inspired chaos that had characterized her best moments with Big Brother. The album was taking shape around a set of songs that were more varied than anything she had previously recorded. Nick Gravenight's Buried Alive in the Blues, Chris Christopherson's Me and Bobby McGee, a song she had written herself called Mercedes-Benz that was recorded in a single take, a cappella, with no instrumentation at all. That song, 3 verses, a simple repeating melody, a lyric that begins with a request to God for a Mercedes-Benz on the grounds that her friends all drive Porsches, is one of the stranger artifacts of her career and one of the most revealing. The song is a joke, or partly a joke. West, it plays on the gap between spiritual aspiration and material desire, between the language of prayer and the content of consumer longing. She performs it with a straight face that is also clearly a performance of a straight face. The humor is in the deadpan, in the commitment to the bit. But the song also, beneath the humor, touches something that was genuinely present in her life, an awareness of the absurdity of having achieved material success and found it insufficient, of being famous and feeling empty, of having spent years wanting things and then getting them and discovering that the getting had not addressed the wanting. She did not write it as a confession. She wrote it by her own description as a bit, as something funny to do in the studio. But funny things are often the truest things. Probably in the fact that she reached for that particular joke at Yusin about wanting things that would make people love her, about praying for objects as substitutes for something that objects cannot provide, suggests that the joke was available to her because it was close to something real. Me and Bobby McGee, written by Chris Christopherson and Fred Foster, had been recorded by others before her, including Christopherson himself and Roger Miller. Her version is the one that has lasted, and it has lasted because of what she does in the final section. The repeated la 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 coda that begins as an extension of the song and gradually becomes something else, a piece of pure vocalization that is no longer about the lyrics at all but about the sound itself, about what her voice could do when it was released from the obligation of meaning. Rothschild let the tape roll through that section without interrupting it, and the decision to let it run and then to keep it in the final recording was one of the most significant production decisions on the album. She recorded her lead vocal on that song on October 1st, 1970. 2 days later, she was dead. But in the sessions before that, in the weeks of September and into October, there was something present that people who were there have consistently described as different from her previous studio work. She was sober, or close to it. She had reduced her heroin use significantly, though the accounts vary on how completely. She was drinking, but more moderately than was typical for her. She was sleeping. She was, by the standards of her own previous behavior, functional in a way that felt, to the people around her, like a genuinely new chapter rather than a temporary stabilization. The engagement to Seth Morgan was ongoing. She wore the ring. She talked about the wedding in the way people talk about future things when they are trying to anchor themselves to a future, with a specificity of detail that suggested she was using the planning as a form of commitment, a way of binding herself to a version of her life that had structure and continuity, and someone in it who had agreed to stay. Whether she believed in the engagement completely, or whether she believed in what it represented, the idea of a life that was settled, that had a shape she had chosen, is not recoverable from the outside. Morgan visited the sessions occasionally. He was peripheral to them in the way that partners of artists are often peripheral to studio work, present in the margins, welcomed and tolerated, not quite part of the thing being made. People who were in the studio remember him as charming and somewhat difficult to read, a person who presented confidence as substance and who had not yet, at 21, been tested in any way that would reveal whether the confidence was backed by anything. She called her mother from Los Angeles in the weeks of the sessions. Dorothy Joplin has described these calls as lighter than usual. Janis talking about the record, about the songs, about being in a good place. Whether Dorothy believed this fully or partially is unclear. She had spent years calibrating how much of what Janis told her to believe, whereas she had not always calibrated correctly in either direction. These calls were warmer than many of the calls that had preceded them, and Dorothy received them with the particular gratitude of a parent who has been worried for a long time and has been given temporarily a reason not to be. The studio at Sunset Sound was a functional, unremarkable space, the kind of room where a great deal of important music was made in that era, without any of the aesthetic qualities that might suggest importance from the outside. The control room was separated from the recording space by glass. The furniture was nondescript. The coffee was bad, universally remembered as bad. She brought her own food sometimes. She had developed in those weeks the habits of someone who was trying to take care of herself, or in the small ways that self-care is first attempted when someone is not yet practiced at it. On the evening of October 3rd, the band had been in the studio without her. She was not scheduled to record that night, and the musicians were working on instrumental tracks, specifically the backing for Buried Alive in the Blues, which was waiting for her vocal. She had been at the studio earlier that day, listening to playbacks and discussing the arrangements. She had left in good spirits, or what people remembered as good spirits, though memory in the aftermath of catastrophe tends to be retrospectively edited in ways that are not entirely reliable. She went back to the Landmark Motor Hotel where she was staying, a functional, slightly worn establishment on Franklin Avenue in Hollywood that was a common base for musicians working in the Los Angeles studios at the time. She stopped at the front desk. She had gone out earlier to Barney's Beanery, a bar on Santa Monica Boulevard where she was a regular, and she had been drinking. The desk clerk remembered that she seemed in reasonable spirits, that she talked for a few minutes, that there was nothing about her behavior that seemed alarming. She went to her room. She did not call anyone. She had been in contact earlier in the day with a dealer, and the heroin she had obtained that night was later determined to be significantly more potent than what she had been using regularly, a fact that emerged in the investigation afterward and that raised questions, never fully resolved, on about whether she had known the difference. The following morning, Sunday, October 4th, her road manager, John Cook, went to the hotel to find out why she had not returned to the studio. He found her on the floor of her room, between the bed and the nightstand, in a position suggesting she had fallen. She had been dead for several hours. She was 27 years old. The vocal for Buried Alive in the Blues had not been recorded. It appears on Pearl as an instrumental, the only track on the album without her voice, a gap in the middle of a record that is otherwise entirely her, surrounded by performances that are among the finest of her career. A silence where a voice should be. The last time Janis Joplin performed in public was on September 19, 1970, at Rice University in Houston, Texas. The show was part of the Full Tilt Boogie Band's touring schedule, a date that had been booked months earlier, and that carried a particular weight she had not anticipated when it was arranged. Houston was close enough to Port Arthur that the audience contained people who had grown up in the same world she had grown up in, people who knew or knew of the girl who had been voted ugliest man on campus, who had eaten lunch alone, who had left and not come back in any way that Port Arthur could recognize as return. She had been to Texas earlier that summer for her 10-year high school reunion from Thomas Jefferson High School, a visit that has been documented in several accounts, and that is one of the more painful episodes of her adult life to examine. She went voluntarily. She could have declined. She was, by that point, considerably more famous than anyone else in her graduating class, and the invitation carried a subtext that was not difficult to read. The girl who had been excluded was now being invited back as a trophy, as evidence that Thomas Jefferson High School had produced someone of significance, regardless of what the school had done to that person while she was there. She went anyway. She dressed up. She told journalists before the visit that she was going back to show them that she had made it, that she was going to lord it over them. And this framing, aggressive, defiant, was the public version of something that was actually more vulnerable. She wanted them to see her. She wanted still, after everything, for the people who had rejected her to acknowledge that they had been wrong. The reunion was uncomfortable in the specific way that these visits tend to be uncomfortable. The people who had been cruel to her were now adults who had jobs and children, and who regarded her fame with a mixture of pride and unease, and none of them were prepared to deliver the explicit reckoning she had traveled back for. They were pleasant. They made conversation. A few of them asked for autographs. She left Port Arthur after the reunion and did not speak about it publicly in any sustained way. The interviews she gave around that time moved past it quickly, as though it were a minor stop on a tour rather than a pilgrimage she had made at considerable psychological cost. The Houston show, 2 months later, was not in Port Arthur, but it was near enough that the geography carried the same emotional charge. Rice University's campus was a different world from the oil refinery streets of her childhood, manicured, academic, populated by people whose relationship to Texas was entirely different from hers. But she was playing in the state, and the state was the state, and the accumulated weight of what Texas meant to her was present in some form in every show she played within its borders. The performance at Rice has been described by people who attended it as one of the finest of the Full Tilt Boogie bands run together. The set list moved through familiar material and newer songs from the sessions that were already underway. She was in full command, the voice in the upper register of what she could do, the band responsive, the connection with the audience immediate and sustained. Did people who were there have described the particular quality of attention she brought to that show? A focus that was different from the desperate energy that had characterized some of her earlier performances, and that felt instead like someone playing from a position of relative security rather than from need. Whether this reading is accurate or whether it is the retrospective idealization of a last performance is impossible to determine. The human mind tends to organize events around their endings, and a last performance will always be described in terms that make it feel like a last performance. What can be said with more certainty is that the people who were there came away with the memory of something that worked. The band, the material, the room, the voice. She came off stage in Houston and the performance ended. The audience left. The crew broke down the equipment. The band went back to whatever they went back to. She went to Los Angeles to continue the recording sessions, and the show at Rice University receded into the past in the way that all performances recede once the audience has gone home. completely and immediately, leaving nothing behind except the memory of people who were there and the silence of a space that is now used for something else. The last studio session she participated in was on October 1st, 1970. She recorded her vocal for Me and Bobby McGee that day, among other work, and Rothschild has described the session as one of the most productive of the entire Pearl recording process. She was focused, she was present, she knew what she wanted from the material, and she got it. Or close enough to it that the difference was not audible in the final recording. The vocal on Me and Bobby McGee is among the most technically accomplished of her career, and it is also, in the extended coda, in the place where the song releases itself from its own structure, among the most unguarded. After the session on October 1st, she went to Barney's Beanery. This has been established in the accounts of several people who were with her, and the accounts agree that she was drinking, but not to a degree that seemed unusual for her. She was in a good mood, or performing a good mood. The two things were not always distinguishable from the outside. She talked, she laughed. She was, by the descriptions of people who were there, recognizably herself in the version of herself that the public knew. She went back to the Landmark Motor Hotel. At some point during the evening, she contacted her dealer, a man named George Sandoz, who has been identified in various accounts of her death. The heroin she purchased that night was from a batch that the Los Angeles County Coroner's investigation later determined was considerably more potent than average. The same batch, as it turned out, had been responsible for several other overdose deaths in Los Angeles in the days around hers. Whether Sandoz knew the potency of what he was selling is not something that was conclusively established in the investigation. Whether she knew is a question that cannot be answered. She injected the heroin in her room at the Landmark. What happened in the minutes afterward, whether she lost consciousness quickly or slowly, whether she was aware at any point that something had gone wrong, is not recoverable. The physical evidence suggested she had attempted to reach the bed and had not made it. John Cook found her the following morning. The investigation that followed her death was relatively brief, as such investigations go. The cause was determined quickly. Acute heroin-morphine intoxication. Accidental. The word accidental carried considerable weight in the aftermath, weight that the people who loved her leaned on with varying degrees of conviction. The alternative reading, that a person who had been using heroin for the better part of a decade, who understood the risks, who had come close to the edge before and had pulled back, was making a choice, at least partly in the act of using again after a period of relative sobriety, was a reading that many people were not willing to hold. Saw it because it implicated the desire alongside the drug, and implicating the desire was harder than blaming the supply. The news of her death was announced on October 4th, 1970. It arrived in the music press and then in the general press with the velocity that such announcements travel when they confirm something people had been half expecting and half dreading. She was the third major rock musician to die at 27 within the span of 14 months. Jimi Hendrix had died on September 18th, and Brian Jones had died in July of 1969. Jim Morrison would follow in July of 1971. The proximity of these deaths produced a cultural narrative, the 27 Club, as it would later be called, that organized the losses into something that felt meaningful, felt patterned, felt like a statement about a generation and its relationship to excess. The narrative was not entirely wrong, but it was also a way of making the deaths legible by making them mythological, and mythologizing them was a way of not examining them too closely. Janis Joplin did not die because she was 27, or because she was a rock star, or because a generation had been defined by its willingness to court destruction. She died in a specific room, on a specific night, of a specific drug, in circumstances that had been shaped by specific choices made by specific people, including her, over the course of a specific life. The reduction of that life to a myth was already beginning before her body was found. It accelerated after. Her will, written some months before her death, contained a provision that has been cited in virtually every account of her life. Now, she left $2,500 for a party, a posthumous party to be held in her honor for her friends. The instruction was carried out. The party was held at a bar in San Rafael, California, some days after her death. People who attended it have described it as both absurd and entirely characteristic. Exactly the kind of thing she would have done. Exactly the kind of gesture that could be read as generosity, or as a final performance, or as both simultaneously, the two things impossible to separate, even in death. She had been trying, for 27 years, to fill a room with people who were there for her. She managed it one last time. There is a particular quality to the way people who knew Janis Joplin talk about her addiction in the interviews that have accumulated over the decades since her death. Right, they tend to begin with the drug. With heroin specifically, with its chemistry and its culture and the specific world in which she encountered it. And then gradually they find themselves talking about something else. They find themselves talking about Port Arthur. They find themselves talking about the reunion, about the engagement, about the look on her face in the moments between performances when the applause had stopped and the room had emptied, and there was nothing left to do except be a person in a quiet space. The drug keeps receding behind the person, and the person keeps receding behind the childhood, and eventually the interviews arrive at the same place that all serious attempts to understand her life arrive. A girl eating lunch alone in a Texas high school. Soars in a room full of people who have decided she does not belong there. This is not a metaphor. It is the literal starting point of a chain of events that produced everything that followed. What heroin does pharmacologically is bind to opioid receptors in the brain and produce a suppression of the stress response, a quieting of the systems that generate anxiety, fear, and the particular form of psychological pain that comes from unmet social need. It does not produce happiness exactly. It produces the absence of a specific kind of suffering. For a person whose baseline state involves a chronic, unappeasable hunger for acceptance, a hunger that has been present since childhood, that has been reinforced by years of rejection, that has never been adequately addressed because the people around her either could not see it clearly or could not provide what it required. The suppression of that suffering is not a small thing. It is, for the duration of the drug's effect, an answer. The answer is temporary. This is the fundamental problem with it, and it is a problem that is obvious from the outside and nearly invisible from the inside, because from the inside, what registers is the answer, not its expiration. Each time the answer expires, the suffering returns, and it returns slightly amplified, partly because of the neurological mechanics of tolerance and withdrawal, and partly because each return of the suffering carries with it the accumulated evidence of all the times it has returned before. The hunger doesn't get smaller with repeated disappointment, and it gets larger. She began using heroin in San Francisco in the early 1960s in circumstances that were socially normalized within the world she was moving through. The normalization was important because it meant that the decision to use did not feel like a decision at all. It felt like participation, like belonging, like doing what the people around her were doing. For someone who had spent her adolescence desperately trying to belong to something and failing, being offered a form of belonging that required only the willingness to participate was not an offer that was easy to refuse. The alcohol was different, and it is worth keeping it separate from the heroin because her relationship with it was different. Alcohol was public in a way that heroin was not. She drank on stage, in interviews, at parties, in bars, in ways that were visible and that became part of her public identity. The Southern Comfort bottle was marketed. She was reportedly paid $10 worth of the product in exchange for the publicity she generated by carrying it on stage, an arrangement that reads, in retrospect, as one of the more dispiriting commercial transactions in the history of the music industry. A young woman's visible dependency was converted into a sponsorship. The alcohol served a slightly different psychological function than the heroin, where heroin quieted the hunger by suppressing the stress response. Alcohol managed the performance anxiety. It lowered the threshold of self-consciousness enough that she could walk out in front of thousands of people and give them what they came for without the layers of insecurity that were present in ordinary social situations. It also, and this is important, maintained the persona. Janis Joplin, the product, was associated with drinking. Audiences expected it. The press expected it. The image required it. She was locked into a public relationship with alcohol that made reducing her consumption not merely a health choice, but a kind of identity crisis. To stop drinking visibly was to stop being the person the public had paid to see. People who have studied addiction tend to describe two broad categories of users: those for whom the substance is primarily physical, whose bodies develop dependency faster and more completely for reasons that appear to be at least partly genetic, and those for whom the substance is primarily psychological, addressing a specific emotional function that nothing else is providing. These categories overlap and interact, and most long-term users develop both physical and psychological dependency simultaneously. But in Janis's case, the psychological function is so legible, so consistently described by people who knew her, so clearly documented in her own statements about what the substances did for her, that it is difficult to examine her addiction without starting there. She told an interviewer in 1970, the specific interview has been cited in multiple sources, but the precise outlet varies, that she drank because it helped her not to care what people thought of her. This is a statement that contains its own contradiction. Caring what people thought of her was so fundamental to her experience that she required a chemical intervention to suppress it. The woman who performed as though she didn't care what anyone thought of her was, beneath the performance, someone who cared with an intensity that made ordinary social interaction difficult. The alcohol was the mechanism by which the performance became possible. The heroin, by the time she was using it regularly in the late 1960s, Aya had shifted from something that quieted the hunger between performances to something that was required for basic daily functioning. This is the trajectory that addiction follows when it is allowed to develop without interruption over a period of years. And it is a trajectory that was not interrupted in her case, because the interruption would have required sustained, coordinated engagement from the people around her at a time when those people had conflicting interests in her continued functionality. Her road manager, her bandmates, her manager, her label. All of these people had financial and professional interests in her continuing to work, and continued work required at minimum the appearance of functionality. As long as she could perform, the incentive to address the underlying problem was reduced. The performances were extraordinary. The records were selling. The machinery was running. The question of whether the machine was running her into the ground was a question that was easier not to ask when the alternative was stopping the machine. There were people who tried. Linda Gravenites, who had been her closest friend in San Francisco and who had made many of her stage costumes, eventually moved away from her in the late 1960s in a decision she has described as partly self-protective. She could see what was happening and she could not stop it, and remaining close meant being a witness to something she was powerless to change. Gravenites has been quoted in various accounts as saying that Janis refused help in the specific way that people refuse it when they have decided, on some level, that they do not deserve it. Now, this is a clinical observation dressed in personal language, but it is also a precise one. The belief that one does not deserve to be helped, or that the help that is being offered is insufficient, is conditional, will eventually be withdrawn, is common among people who have experienced chronic rejection in childhood. It expresses itself not as a stated belief, but as a behavioral pattern, the refusal of genuine offers of support, the selection of relationships that are unlikely to provide stability, the preference for situations in which the worst expectations are confirmed, rather than situations in which they might be challenged. Janis's pattern of relationships, the people she chose, the speed with which she gave herself to them, like the way she experienced their inevitable limitations as personal rejection, was consistent with this dynamic in a way that several of the people who knew her best have described in retrospect with something between grief and precision. She had been to rehabilitation facilities before her death, or had attempted versions of what was available in the late 1960s, which were considerably more limited than what became available in subsequent decades. The language of addiction as illness rather than moral failure was not yet dominant in American culture. The treatment frameworks that are now standard, the understanding of dependency as a neurological condition requiring medical intervention, the emphasis on sustained support structures rather than individual willpower, were not available to her in any coherent form. What was available was the injunction to stop, delivered by people who loved her, but did not always know how to help her stop, and the counterculture's ambient philosophy that all of her behavior, including the self-destructive behavior, was an expression of authentic freedom. The authentic freedom framework was particularly damaging for her because it provided a language in which her dependency could be reframed as choice, as refusal of conformity, as the price of being fully alive. She used this language herself in interviews to describe the way she lived, whether she believed it or whether she was translating for public consumption. Something that was actually more desperate is impossible to determine. Both are probably partly true. She had absorbed the counterculture's idiom deeply enough that it had become part of her self-understanding, even in places where it was doing her harm. The months before her death have been examined by people trying to determine whether she was getting better or getting worse. The evidence is genuinely mixed. She had reduced her heroin use. She was more focused in the studio than she had been in years. She was engaged to be married. These are the indicators of someone moving towards stability. She was also drinking heavily, had a history of substituting one substance for another without addressing the underlying need, was engaged to someone who was manifestly not equipped to provide what she required, and was, by the accounts of several people close to her, it's still in the grip of the same loneliness that had defined her since childhood, wearing it better, managing its expression more carefully, but not free of it. The night of October 3rd was not an anomaly. It was the continuation of a pattern that had been running for years, a pattern of reaching for the answer, of choosing the thing that worked briefly over the things that might have worked sustainably, but were harder and slower and less certain. She had been taught by a childhood of repeated rejection that the slower and harder things did not ultimately deliver. She had been taught that the thing you work for does not come. She had been given in heroin an answer that was immediate and reliable and chemical, and she had spent a decade learning to need it. On a night in October, she needed it. In the particular form it took that night was more than her body could manage. This is the narrow clinical account of what happened. The wider account of the one that includes Port Arthur and the letter to her parents, and the reunion and the party she planned for after her death, and the voice on Me and Bobby McGee in the place where the song releases itself from its own structure, is harder to summarize because it refuses to end at the point where the clinical account ends. She had been trying in the only ways available to her to answer a question she had been carrying since she was a child. The question was simple, and it was unanswerable by the means she was using to answer it. The tragedy is not that she died young. The tragedy is that the tools she had been given by her childhood, by her culture, by the machinery that surrounded her, were not adequate to the work that needed doing, and that no one who had adequate tools ever got close enough to offer them in a way she was able to receive. Pearl was released on January 11, 1971, 3 months and 1 week after Janis Joplin died on the floor of a room at the Landmark Motor Hotel. It entered the Billboard charts immediately and rose to number 1, where it remained for 9 weeks. Me and Bobby McGee was released as a single and reached number 1 as well, the first posthumous number 1 single in the history of the American charts. The album sold millions of copies in its first year and has continued selling in the decades since. It is, by any commercial measure, the most successful record of her career. The timing of the release, so close to her death, and close enough that the grief was still fresh in the people who had known her and still present in the broader culture that had claimed her, meant that the album was received not simply as music, but as a document, as evidence, as the last thing she had left. Reviews that might have been mixed in a different context were almost uniformly reverential. Critics who had found her previous work uneven discovered in Pearl a coherence and authority that they attributed to artistic maturity. Whether that maturity was genuinely present in the music, or whether it was being projected onto the music by people who needed to believe she had arrived somewhere before she died, is a question that the reviews do not pause to ask. The music industry moved quickly in the months after her death. Columbia Records released Pearl on schedule and promoted it with the efficiency of a commercial operation that had a product ready and a market that was, for the worst possible reasons, primed to receive it. There was nothing cynical in the obvious sense about this. The album was finished. The promotion was planned. The infrastructure was in place. The industry did what it does. But the speed of the transition from person to product, from the woman who had died in a hotel room to the image being reproduced on album covers and in magazine spreads, had a quality that the people closest to her found difficult to process. Albert Grossman retained his percentage. The contractual arrangements that had been in place during her life continued to operate after it, in generating revenue from her recordings and her image that flowed through the structures he had built. The disputes over royalties and accounting that had been developing in the months before her death were resolved through negotiations with her estate that were conducted without her participation, by definition, and on terms that the estate, her parents, her siblings, people who had not been closely involved in the business of her career, were not particularly equipped to evaluate. The settlements were reached, the money moved, the machine continued. Seth Morgan, the fiancé, gave interviews in the weeks after her death. He was 21 years old, and he was suddenly a figure in a story much larger than he had anticipated when he had accepted the ring he had given her. The interviews were published. Still, he spoke about her with a tenderness that may have been genuine, and that was also inevitably the tenderness of someone who had not yet been tested by the relationship he was describing, who had been engaged for a matter of weeks to a woman he had not known for long, and who was now speaking about her in the past tense to journalists who needed quotes. He went on to live a life that was, by his own later accounts, considerably more troubled than the polished young man of those early interviews suggested. He died in 1990 in a motorcycle accident in Baltimore. He was 41. The posthumous narrative that formed around Janis Joplin in the years after her death drew on the materials of her actual life, but arranged them into a shape that the actual life had not had. The shape required a clear arc. The girl who was rejected, who suffered, who found her voice, who burned too bright, who died too young. This arc is emotionally satisfying in a way that lives are not emotionally satisfying, because lives do not have clean arcs. They have repetitions, reversals, unresolved conditions, periods that resist interpretation. The arc that was constructed around her required editing those periods out and emphasizing the moments that fit. The 27 Club narrative, which had begun forming around the deaths of Brian Jones and Jimi Hendrix before her, and would be cemented by Jim Morrison's death the following year, provided a frame that was particularly convenient because it was larger than any individual life. Her death became part of a pattern, and the pattern was about a generation, about the cost of authenticity, tired about the price of being fully alive in a world not equipped to accommodate that aliveness. This framing was not invented maliciously. It emerged from genuine attempts to make sense of losses that were difficult to make sense of, but it also, in the process of making sense, smoothed over the specific woman, the specific childhood, the specific machinery that had surrounded her and shaped the conditions of her death. The biographies came. The first significant ones appeared in the mid to late 1970s, while the people who had known her were still alive and still willing to talk, and they produced accounts that were richer and more complicated than the myth, accounts that included Port Arthur, the reunion, the contracts, the pattern of relationships, the specific texture of the loneliness. These books were read, were discussed, were cited in subsequent work. They did not substantially alter the myth. The myth operated at a different level than biography, in the place where culture stores its symbols, and symbols are not revised by facts in the way that historical accounts are revised. In 1979, a film called The Rose was released starring Bette Midler in a role that was openly based on Joplin's life without being explicitly identified as such. The film was commercially successful and was received as a tribute. It was also, in several of its key choices, a romanticization. It found in the material a tragedy with cleaner lines than the actual life had, a protagonist whose suffering was more legible and whose end was more dramatically satisfying. People who had known Janis Joplin watched it and found it both recognizable and wrong in ways they found difficult to articulate, because the wrongness was not in any specific fact, but in the overall shape, in the way the shape required her suffering to mean something that her actual suffering had not meant. Her hometown of Port Arthur has returned to her in the decades since her death, in the way that hometowns return to the famous people they once rejected, with plaques and festivals and a tourist infrastructure built around the person they did not want while she was alive. There is a Janis Joplin Museum in Port Arthur. There is a bronze statue. There is an annual birthday celebration. The people who run these commemorations speak about her with genuine pride, and the pride is genuine in the sense that it is felt, not performed. Well, but it is also pride in the product rather than in the person. Pride in the voice, the records, the fame, the measurable impact, rather than in the specific, difficult, unaccommodated woman who grew up in their town and spent her life trying to escape what it had done to her. The music has lasted in a way that is worth saying plainly, without the framing of legacy or cultural significance. It has lasted because it is good, because the voice was real and the performances were real, and the best recordings capture something that was happening in the room that cannot be manufactured after the fact. Me and Bobby McGee has been played on radio stations continuously since 1971. Piece of My Heart has appeared in films and television programs and advertisements with a regularity that suggests the culture has decided it needs the song available at all times. Mercedes-Benz has been used in a Porsche advertisement, a fact that lands with a specific irony when you know what the song is actually about. The Porsche advertisement ran in 2019. The song it used was written by a woman who had grown up poor in Texas and who had performed it as a joke about wanting things that would make people love her. The car company paid for the rights. The advertisement was considered effective. No one involved appears to have found this arrangement uncomfortable. Her image has been reproduced on posters, t-shirts, coffee mugs, tote bags, daring the full range of objects through which the culture processes its dead icons into purchasable form. The image most commonly used is the one that emphasizes the performance. The feather bows, the wild hair, the open-mouthed expression of someone in the middle of a scream. The image from the recording booth is not the one that sells. The image of someone listening to her own voice come back at her through the monitors in a room with no audience does not reproduce well on merchandise because it does not confirm what the merchandise needs to confirm. What the merchandise needs to confirm is the version of her that the culture found useful. The woman who didn't care, who lived hard, who gave everything and burned out spectacularly, who was so herself that the world couldn't contain her. This version is not entirely false, ma'am, but it is a version that requires not seeing the lunch table in Port Arthur, not reading the letters she wrote to her parents, not sitting with the particular quality of her loneliness in the hours between performances when the applause had stopped and the silence had returned and she was simply a woman in a room, waiting for something she could not name to arrive and fill the space that nothing in 27 years had managed to fill. The Full Tilt Boogie Band's musicians dispersed after her death and went on to other work. Richard Bell, whose piano had been so important to the Pearl sessions, died in 2012. John Till continued working as a musician for decades. Clark Pearson, Brad Campbell, Ken Pearson. They moved through the years that she did not have, carrying the memory of those sessions, of the train across Canada, of the Harvard Stadium show, of what it had been like to be in a room with that voice when it was doing what it could do. Paul Rothchild, who had produced Pearl and who had described her as the most naturally gifted vocalist he had ever recorded, died in 1995. He gave interviews over the years in which he returned to the sessions, to the specific moments and specific takes that he had preserved on tape. He described in one interview the moment when she finished the coda on Me and Bobby McGee, the extended, released, formless section at the end, and looked up through the glass at him in the control room. He said she was smiling. He said it was the smile of someone who had done the thing they most needed to do and who knew it. He kept the tape rolling. The coda went on for another 40 seconds after that moment. And all of it is in the final recording. The voice doing what the voice could do in a room in Los Angeles in the last week of September 1970, with no audience except the engineer and the producer and the musicians behind her, and the tape machine recording everything. She was 27 years old. She had been making music for most of her adult life. She had been running for all of it towards something that the music briefly provided and then withheld, that the audiences briefly provided and then withheld, that the substances briefly provided and then withheld. In those 40 seconds at the end of that song, with no narrative to maintain and no persona to perform, and nothing required of her except the voice doing what the voice could do. In those 40 seconds, the running stopped. And then the song ended, and the tape stopped. Right, and the session was over, and she put on her coat and went back out into the night. What remains, when the myth is set aside, is not easily summarized. This is partly because she resists summarization. She always did, which was part of what made her difficult to accommodate in the world she moved through. And partly because the questions her life raises do not resolve into answers that can be stated cleanly and left alone. She wanted to be loved. She said this so many times in so many interviews that it became a kind of verbal tic, a signature line delivered with the self-deprecating humor she used to make difficult truths approachable. She said it as a joke, and she said it seriously, and she said it in the specific tone that lies between the two. The tone that people use when they are telling the truth but cannot quite bear to tell it without the protection of a performance around it. The line was quoted in obituaries. It was printed on posters. It became part of the myth, proof of her authenticity, her vulnerability, her willingness to say what others concealed. What the obituaries and the posters did not include was the context. She did not say she wanted to be loved the way someone says they want a glass of water, as a simple statement of preference, easily satisfied. She said it the way someone says something they have been carrying for so long that saying it out loud no longer feels like disclosure. The wanting had been there since childhood. It had shaped every significant decision she made. It had driven her onto stages and into relationships and into the needle and the bottle, and it had not been answered by any of them, not in any lasting way. The question her life keeps returning to is not why she died. That question has a clinical answer, arrived at by a coroner in Los Angeles in October 1970, and the answer is accurate as far as it goes. The question that does not have an answer is simpler and harder. What would have been sufficient? What, if anything, could have addressed the need that no amount of applause and no chemical and no relationship managed to address? Whether the need was addressable at all, or whether it was the kind of wound that does not close, that can be managed, covered, worked around, but not healed in any complete sense. The people who loved her do not agree on this. Some of them believe that if the circumstances had been different, if she had found the right person, if she had gotten sustained help earlier, if the industry had been structured differently, if Port Arthur had been different, she could have found a way to live with the need rather than being consumed by it. Others are less certain. They watched her refuse help in the specific way she refused it, watched her choose the thing that worked briefly over the thing that might have worked sustainably, and they are not sure that the refusal was simply circumstantial. Not sure that different circumstances would have produced a different choice. She is buried in Lawton, Oklahoma, in a cemetery where her grave has become a site that people visit and leave things at: flowers, bottles of Southern Comfort, photographs, handwritten notes. The notes tend to say versions of the same thing: that her music meant something to the person who wrote the note, that she is not forgotten, that she is loved. The bottles of Southern Comfort are a more complicated offering, a tribute that also reproduces the image she was trapped in, that honors her with the prop she was handed by a manager in a market and eventually could not put down. She would probably have found this funny. She had a capacity for dark humor about her own situation that was one of the more honest things about her. She could see the irony of being Janis Joplin without it helping her to be anything else. The seeing and the changing were different capabilities, and she had the first more fully than the second. What the voice on those recordings asks in the end is not a musical question. It is the same question she was asking at the lunch table in Port Arthur, in the coffee houses in San Francisco, at Monterey, on the Festival Express train moving through the Canadian dark. It is the question underneath all the noise, underneath the performance and the persona and the myth that formed around them. She never stopped asking it. The tape caught it, preserved it, plays it back. The question is still there. Every time the music starts, the answer is still not there.